Welcome back for part two of my workshop entitled Shed Light on Those Magnolias, Case Studies in Louisiana Research. Okay, now we are about to get into some topics that I'm really excited about because everything I've discussed so far pertains to post-Civil War records. For African American genealogical research, the goal and challenge are to find pre-Civil War era evidence of your ancestors' existence. The basic research and methodologies I've covered so far are building blocks for the remaining case studies in this presentation. In this next case study, I will be focusing on how these records can shed more light on your magnolias by delving into special records such as secessions, historical newspapers, museum collections, and maps. This is the death certificate of my great-grandfather, Emmanuel Willis Jr. When my family members referred to him and his father in their southern drawl, they would say, Manuel, which was written phonetically as Manuel Willis. See, my paternal lineage is easy to remember because the fathers always named their sons after themselves, except for me. My dad's name is Sanders Emmanuel Willis Jr. My grandfather was Sanders Willis Sr. His father is this guy on the death certificate, Emmanuel Jr., and his father was Emmanuel Sr. So I can't tell you how grateful that I am for the fact that I was able to teach this to my kids and it was made easy. You know, they've had it down since before the age of 10. When I was a teenager and before I knew any of this, I asked my father why he had the middle name Emmanuel, but his dad didn't. And he said he had legally changed his name and added it, Emmanuel, as a middle name. And when I asked why, he said, well, his father told him that the names Emmanuel and Sanders were prominent names in our family history. And since my father liked the name so much, he wanted to make sure that the name was never lost. Well, I never forgot that. And as a result of discovering the details of my family history, which I'm about to share, and remembering what my father told me when I had my firstborn son, I named him Xavier Emmanuel Willis to ensure the name carried on. Anyway, my grandfather Sanders and his siblings, when they referred to their grandfather Emmanuel Sr., they used to call him Papa Manuel. So I will refer to him as such to avoid confusion between junior and senior. Now in this document, you can see that my great-grandfather Manuel Jr. died in South Baton Rouge at the age of 28 in 1931. And based on the records I've uncovered, I know he was older than that. He was probably born around 1895. So he's really more like 35 years old, but still that's very young. He was survived by his wife, my great-grandmother, Artemise Benton Willis, the same woman that I mentioned earlier, who's the oldest child of Edward Benton and Mamie Penny, and the older sister of Arthur Benton in that case study. Well, I knew her very well, and she died in 1995. Now, it also states that his place of birth was listed as Conrad. His parents are listed as Manuel Willis, which is Papa Manuel, and Virginia Washington, both of Ben-Hur, Louisiana. The critical piece of information here is the informant, his father, Papa Manuel. Because who better to provide accurate information about the son than the father, right? Papa Manuel stated he lived on Buchanan Street, which many family members who knew him and lived with him confirmed. My grandfather's sister, the late Aunt Ruth Willis Castle, told me that her dad died of double pneumonia. And as you can see here, she was right because the cause of death is listed as labor pneumonia. Now, Ben-Hur and Conrad were places I'd never heard of before. But given that Papa Manuel was more than likely born before the end of the Civil War, I started to wonder if these were areas they may have lived on plantations. Now, in researching this lineage and speaking with my great aunts, one of the things I learned was that besides Emmanuel Jr., Papa Manuel and Virginia had 18 other children, and unfortunately, Papa Manuel outlived 5 of them. Here's an example of one of them named Albert Willis, who died 7 years earlier around the age of 23. Papa Manuel was the informant on his death certificate too, and he stated that Albert had died in South Baton Rouge, and was also born in Conrad, but this time when he stated where he and his wife were born, he stated He didn't state Ben-Hur, he stated Mulberry Grove Plantation, and that Virginia, his wife, was born at Hollywood Plantation. This really intrigued me because it seems to be more specific, so I had to investigate it. One of the online tools I love to use is historical newspaper repositories online. And there are several. There's chroniclingamerica.gov, which is free. There's newspapers.com, which is a paid subscription. There are several available through libraries and universities. But my favorite for Louisiana Research is genealogybank.com. The site has over 2 billion records, and its search query functions are powerful when you learn some of the tricks of the trade. Searching is free, but a monthly or annual subscription is required for unlimited access to the full text of printed articles. You can save your searches and download the articles in a JPEG or PDF format. Orleans and Baton Rouge Parish both have an impressive collection of newspapers that span over 175 years, and their obituary collections are unparalleled. So keep in mind that major cities such as these didn't just report local news, they would report news from across the state and the country. Additionally, other parish newspapers are also on genealogybank.com. Their collections may not be as extensive, but they are still worth exploring. Trust me on this. Otherwise, chroniclingamerica.gov and newspaper.com, which has over 6 billion records, they may be better choices. I had success with the former chroniclingamerica.gov in finding incredible records on my West Feliciana Parish relatives, which I'll cover later. I decided to search Louisiana newspapers for any reference to Ben-Hur, so I used the keywords Ben-Hur Plantation in my search. I kept the search broad by not specifying a particular city, but I did choose a range of years just prior to the beginning of the Civil War through the turn of the century, and then my plan was to work my way backwards. You'll notice the third result is from the New Orleans major publication known as the Times-Picayune, dated May 16, 1894. The thumbnail image caught my attention because it says the famed Ben-Hur Plantation. Now, doesn't that sound juicy? When I clicked on it, it referred to an advertisement for a land sale. Here it says Magnificent Sugar Estate, the famed Ben-Hur Plantation on the left bank of the Mississippi River, about 10 miles below Baton Rouge. It goes on to describe an attached property known as Mulberry Grove Plantation and another tract of land attached to the sugar estate known as Hollywood Plantation, both comprising Ben-Hur Plantation. The rest of the ad describes structures on the estate such as the sugar house, machinery apparatus for manufacturing sugar, cabins, barns, overseer's house, schoolhouse, blacksmith shop, cane shed, and mentions the presence of 103 mules, 1 horse, 8 heads of cattle, plows, wagons, and much more for conducting, quote, a first-class sugar plantation, unquote. The final quote says, the Ben-Hur is one of the grand sugar plantations of the state, noted for its productiveness, excellent condition, shipping advantages by rail and water, only a few hours ride from the city. It's safe from overflow and has a new levee built by the United States government. So what can we deduce from this published advertisement? Well, first, Ben-Hur Plantation was a sugar manufacturing operation on the Mississippi River. 2, it was originally 2 independent plantations, Mulberry Grove and Hollywood, which explains why Papa Emanuel elaborated on the locations on Albert's death certificate in 1924, 30 years after this advertisement was posted. 3, the 2 lands were next to each other and more than likely consolidated into Ben-Hur at some point after the war by previous owners. 4, sugar manufacturing remained in operation 30 years after the end of the war and beyond, right around the time of my great-grandfather Emanuel Willis Jr.'s birth. But also that they noticed that they mentioned the presence of a schoolhouse. This all makes sense because if you factor in the time of Reconstruction after the war, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established by Congress in 1865, probably helped establish freedmen schools to educate newly freed children, and the structures remained in existence. Which leads me to one last observation, that my family, many other freedmen, and the next generations were continuing to work on these plantations as sharecroppers, blacksmiths, and general laborers long after the war was over due to the labor contracts established by the Freedmen's Bureau between the owners and freedmen so that they could receive living wages. And to provide you some proof of my theories, here is evidence that I found on the New Orleans Historical Collections website. In a later case study, I'll provide more detail about that repository, but for now, I just want to show you these very important pictures that pertain to Ben-Hur Plantation. I typed in the words Ben-Hur, and these 5 search results popped up. These 2 on the far right show actual photographs taken in 1889 on the plantation, 5 years before that advertisement was published. When you click on the first one entitled High Water on Ben-Hur Plantation Taking Freight Back, it gives you detailed information about the image. It provides the object number, the item type, the title of it, what collection it's in, and a description that you see here, which says view a group of laborers, some carrying sacks or boxes on a levee and a gangplank. The water is high and appears to have broken a levee. Ben-Hur Plantation was located in East Baton Rouge Parish and was also known as Mulberry Grove and comprised what was also known as Hollywood Plantation. I'm sure besides seeing this image online, you could probably request to see the original if you were to visit the facility in New Orleans, which I did back in 2013, but I was not aware of this picture then. Here's a close-up of the picture showing the inscription that was used as the title of the catalog. Here's the description of the second picture entitled Landing at Ben-Hur Plantation, where it says, view of 4 men on gangplank. 2 are standing at the far end and appear to be waiting for the gangplank to be lowered to the shore. 2 other men hold the end of a thick board and appear to be preparing to take it off the boat. Ben-Hur Plantation was located in East Baton Rouge Parish, approximately 11 miles downriver from Baton Rouge. And it goes on to say came from a page from a Discbound album. And here's a close-up of that photo. Now again, these pictures were taken only 5 years before that newspaper advertisement was published. If you recall, the newspaper advertisement stated that Ben-Hur was safe from overflow and that it had a new levee installed by the U.S. government. Well, now we have potential evidence of that. Could the government have paid the owners to have its day laborers, these men, work to repair the levees? You know, I saw these for the first time just a few months ago, and I nearly became emotional because I just couldn't help but think that one of these men walking along the gangplank or on the levee could be my great-great-grandfather, Papa Manuel. You just never know, because I have collected enough evidence over the years to prove that Ben-Hur was where he worked and lived until the plantation was no more. Now, in this case study, I also want to cover another cool topic which has to do with looking at state and parish maps. Historical maps are invaluable to researchers like you and I because sometimes they answer some of our most critical research questions. I took this photograph in 2013 of a 6-foot map mounted on the wall of the Louisiana State Archives. The title of this map is called Plantations of the Mississippi River from Natchez to New Orleans, 1858. The way they designed this map is a little bit confusing because the left column shows the plantations along the Mississippi River from north to south, crossing from the Mississippi-Louisiana state line, which is cool because it really puts into perspective how closely associated all these plantations and planters were. The right side actually rotates. It's a rotated continuation of the Mississippi River through southwest Louisiana and southeast Louisiana, starting from the top of the image all the way down to the bottom where you see the word river. In that area is where the Louisiana River travels around New Orleans near Lake Pontchartrain. The parishes that touch the river and are present on the map are both East and West Feliciana Parish, Point Capee, East and West Baton Rouge, Iberville, Ascension, St. James, St. John the Baptist, St. Charles, Jefferson, and Orleans Parish. This map gives you a snapshot in history of the plantations that existed along the Mississippi and who the plantation owners were. This is a screenshot of the same map, but it's a different image that I found online that gives you a great view of the area where my ancestors were enslaved. And as you can see, it lists the names of the plantations and the abbreviated name of the plantation owners. I can't tell you how invaluable this is to Louisiana researchers. I mean, I just can't quantify this. So on this map, you see here, it says F.D. Conrad. That's the name of the plantation owner, and his plantation was known as Cottage Plantation. But there are at least 2 more areas identified as Conrad's land. I bring this up because Papa Manuel said his sons were born in Conrad, Louisiana. In addition to that, look at the lands near Conrad. Hollywood Plantation, owned by A. Bird, and next door is Mulberry Grove Plantation, owned by G. Degg. To clearly identify Papa Emanuel or the generations before him as slaves in this region, the first step was to work my way backwards by seeing what clues I could find from any death information on him. His death certificate stated that the informant was his second wife, Lavinia Willis. She stated he was born November 11, 1864, and died at the age of 92 on December 15, 1956, and that his parents were Emanuel Willis and Artemise Harris. Well, if that were true, that would be a third Emanuel. Further research showed that on Papa Manuel's marriage license application to Lavinia, when he was 72 years old, he stated that his parents' names were Sanders Willis and again Artemise Harris. Sanders Willis. So with 2 different sources showing 2 different names for his father, if I had to choose which source I thought was reliable, I would choose this one, recorded when he was alive versus the one recorded after he died, because he would be the primary source on the marriage record, not the death certificate. Secondly, on Ancestry.com, there's a collection known as the U.S. Social Security Application Claims Index from 1936 to 2007, in which I found this record under Lavinia's name, but Papa Manuel's birth date and his parents' names. This definitely confused me. So I ordered a copy of the original document from the Freedom of Information website to analyze it, and I noticed several errors, such as the spelling of his mother's name. And why is Lavinia's occupation listed here? Papa Manuel was not a cook, so inexplicably her information is mixed with his. But what I focused on was the fact that his father's name was listed as Sandy Willis. Again, this is consistent with what he stated on his marriage license application. Okay, so let's pull back and ask ourselves, what do we know from here? Well, we know his recorded birth year is 1864, but what I did not show you are census records showing that Emanuel's living in East Baton Rouge Parish between 1870 and 1900. All of his birth dates that are listed range anywhere from 1859 to 1863. So it could be that he was just a few years older. It's a common occurrence that formerly enslaved people are typically older than their estimated birth dates. We know he lived in East Baton Rouge Parish all of his life, and we know his parents' names were Sanders or Sandy Willis and Artemise Harris. According to him, he was born on Mulberry Grove Plantation before slavery ended, and based on parish maps, we know that Mulberry Grove was owned by this G. Degg. In 2012, I hired my good friend Judy Riffle, who is nationally renowned as the lead genealogist on the Georgetown Memory Project and has been featured on the TV shows Who Do You Think You Are, Finding Your Roots, and Genealogy Roadshow. I'd hired her to go to Baton Rouge to the Parish Courthouse and search their conveyances and probate records for more information on Mulberry Grove Plantation. What she found when she examined the plantations that were around Ben-Hur was that G. Degg was also known as Gilbert Degg, and that he did in fact own Mulberry Grove Plantation. His wife, Mary C. Degg, opened probate, and an inventory of property was recorded and appraised. In probates and/or successions such as these, you hope to find the inventories recorded in the probate that list all property of these Southern planters and even their wives. Those inventories will include furniture, animal, land, crops, and yes, enslaved people. But keep in mind, finding enslaved people is only possible if the property owner died to prior to the end of the Civil War, as was the case here. And if they died closer to the end of the war or after, you won't find an inventory of enslaved people because they were emancipated after that time. Usually at least two people are appointed by the courts to appraise the value of every single item of merchandise in the decedent's possession. Daig's probate was a perfect example of this. His probate stated that on the 16th day of September in the year of our Lord 1859, the parish recorder was commissioned to take inventory of his property. Thompson J. Bird and Jackson Libby were appointed by the courts to appraise the value of the property. The inventory was divided into three parts. There was the separate property owned by Gilbert Daig, which you see here, which is defined as property he owned before he married his wife. Then there is community property, which are all items purchased and acquired during their marriage. And the separate property of Mary C. Daig is the final piece, which is defined as property she owned and acquired prior to her marriage to her husband. Anyone who's familiar with estate planning is familiar with these principles, but for us as African American genealogists, this kind of information is an absolute gem because it helps us construct the timeline our enslaved ancestors were purchased by slave owners. That is, if they weren't born on the plantation. Information like this can be found in conveyance records and bills of sale to track the transaction history, or more directly, the buying and selling of our ancestors. For most of us, this is the only path to traveling back to our African origins. At any rate, the next page focuses on Gilbert's separate plantation known as Orange Grove and his inventory. There are 36 people listed here. The estimated value of the land and these slaves is $39,450. The second section refers to the community property owned between Gilbert and his wife, Mary C. Bird, who's referred here by her maiden name. And if you recall, a man named Thompson J. Bird was appointed by the courts to help appraise the property. Before I continue, I want to stop and emphasize to those of you involved in slavery research how important it is to research the slave-owning families as if they were your own family. Most of the time, these kinds of transactions occur between families, so it's important to understand how you have to track the buying and selling of your ancestors through familial connections. With that being said, I built a family tree on Gilbert Daig and discovered that his wife, Mary Caroline Bird, was the sister of Thompson J. Bird, and their father, Abraham Bird Jr., is the A. Bird listed as the owner of Hollywood Plantation, which was next door to Mulberry Grove Plantation on the map that I showed you. Abraham Bird Jr. was one of the wealthiest and most prominent planters in Louisiana, as was his father before him. In continuing with the community property, the succession describes the next plantation as the primary residence of the couple, and that the land was bounded on the north by Dennis Daig and F.D. Conrad, south by the Mississippi River, east by Mrs. Zenon Daig, and west by Abraham Bird, with all the buildings and improvements thereon valued at $70,000. If we look at this map again, we realize they're describing Mulberry Grove Plantation, even though it is not explicitly named in the probate. Bounded on the north side by Dennis Daig and F.D. Conrad, south by the Mississippi River, east by Mrs. Zenon Daig, and west by Abraham Bird's property. After that, the inventory lists about 41 enslaved people, animals, and crops, all appraised to be worth $133,446, and that's including the land. In today's dollars, that's approximately $4,600,881. So that gives you an idea of the amount of wealth circulating through the industry of slavery at its peak. What's notable here is that there is a male named Sandy, aged 26, valued at $1,500. If he's 26 in 1859, that places his birth year around 1833. And if Papa Manuel was born around the early 1860s, Sandy would be old enough to be his father. Additionally, census records consistently report his mother to be born around 1840 to 41. So she would have been in her early 20s. So the math is mathing. Now the floodgates of information exploded for me beyond this point. And this was all because of the great work Judy Riffle did for me back in 2012. But I had to pay her to do it because I didn't have the means to travel to Louisiana and search it on my own. Additionally, she only provided a few transcriptions of certain pages because the entire probate was extensive and the copies were expensive. Some of these probates and conveyance records can be over 100 pages, and in certain parishes, they may charge you $1 to $2 per page, and that's a lot of money. The great news is that due to the existence of the Family Search Catalog, you can now view these entire record sets for free. The advantage of that perk is having the ability to read the entire succession or conveyance to get the full context of what transpired at that time and acquire additional clues that can lead to more information and more records. The only other fact I want to point out about this inventory is something that you would think doesn't have anything to do with my research questions about the Willises, but I found out years later it actually did. If you will turn your attention to the final section of this inventory that details the third component of this inventory, Mary C. Daigg, and her separate property, among her slaves, you will find a slave named Harriet, age 27, with her children, Thomas, age 9, William, age 8, Johnson, age 6, a girl, Gertrude, age 3, all valued at a total of $3,500 in 1859. When Judy searched for me, she also searched baptismal records found in the Diocese of Baton Rouge Catholic Church records. She compiled a list of enslaved people that Gilbert Daigg and Mary Bird had baptized at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Baton Rouge, and she told me to study those names because there may be family in the list. I ordered a copy of a few books in the series. I believe there were 12 volumes. Volume 9 listed baptisms that occurred between 1855 and 1858, just shortly before this inventory was recorded. The following individuals appear to be the same ones in the inventory. There was Thomas, listed at approximately 4 years old, William listed at 8 years old in 1855. Thomas's age advanced correctly, but William's did not. Again, these are transcriptions, so without seeing the actual document myself, I reserve judgment on the data. Then we have Henry listed at approximately 9 months in 1855, more consistent there, and then Gertrude listed at approximately 4 months old in 1856. Hers is the most accurate. And then we have Harriet, who was baptized the year before, and she was listed as 1 year older. The reason why I mention this family is because if there was any doubt about where my research was leading me, those doubts were put to rest years later when I tried to figure out how 3 third cousin matches were related to me, my dad, his paternal uncle, and all of his paternal cousins. I had discovered after 1.5 years of investigating these matches in their family trees that they descended from a woman named Lucy Bird Cook, who was born around 1861, 2 years after this inventory was recorded. She was one of the younger children of Harriet and Lawrence Bird. When I built her family tree, I discovered her lineage to these same names from the baptismal records and realized this other family unit of enslaved people were related to me. It was clear I was on the right path. The last document that I want to share with you from the succession of Gilbert Daigg involves his wife, Mary, petitioning with the court on March 21st, 1861 to provision her account of administration over her husband's estate. In these probate court provisions, estate sales can be requested and initiated to settle outstanding debts or pay out the inheritance to heirs. One of the first steps would be to advertise the sale in the newspapers, like the example I showed you for Ben-Hur. But in this case, she claimed that her estate sale was never homologated or approved by the court, and therefore it was never advertised in the newspaper. Now, please take note of the time frame here. Gilbert died in 1859, so we are 2 years into this probate case. And at the same time, we are at the dawn of the Civil War, which begins only 22 days later. With that context, you may understand why she goes on to state that since her court filing, she reports that the estate has produced no revenues and that the value of the slaves belonging to the estate has been utterly destroyed because many of them had run away and could not be reclaimed, which significantly reduced the production of crops on the plantation. In other words, the estate was losing its worth with each passing day, and the amount of inheritance left to her kids was shrinking exponentially. But what this also signified for me was that Sandy may have been one of those slaves to run away. And I only say that because I've never found a record of him in the census, and he may have died long before deaths were recorded statewide, particularly for African Americans. At any rate, this is why you hope to obtain records like these that can help you build a narrative on your ancestors' lives and what they went through. In this case study, I want to share with you an example of Louisiana Special Collections that have on-site repositories with online resources that lead you to invaluable descriptive pamphlets and finding aids that guide you through those collections. So in this case study, we have the death certificate of my great-great-grandfather's half-first cousin on his mother's side, Virgil Sterling. Through oral history, we know that he was the son of Colonel Lewis Sterling Jr., who's listed here as his father, and Cecily Bryant, one of Sterling's slaves. Lewis was owner of Wakefield Plantation in West Feliciana Parish. Several of my cousins descend from this man. Virgil was listed as 78 years old at the time of his death, which places his birth at approximately 1852. The Louisiana State University Special Collections Department, located at Hill Memorial Library on the campus, is one of the best resources for Louisiana slave records. They house family papers from slave-owning families if they've survived time and were donated. What's cool about this repository is that they now post digital copies of their descriptive pamphlets and finding aids online through a searchable index on their website. From their website, you would click on research and then click on manuscript collections. Then you would click on finding aids. And when you get here, you would type the keywords of your search. And as you can see here, all I did was type the name Sterling to search for any titles of collections associated with that name. And look what pops up, the Lewis Sterling family papers. When you click on the link, it takes you to the finding aid, which is in PDF format, so you can easily print it out. It gives you great information about the time frames the documents were drafted, what languages the documents are in, wonderful summaries of what's in the collection, any associated collections that may lead to hints for more information to review, source citations, and the specific locations that these collections can be found in the vaults at Hill Memorial Library. This information at the bottom is the most critical because this is what you will refer to when you go to the facility and request to see documents. You'll know exactly where they are and how to request them, which will save you tons of time. I want to direct your attention to this notation towards the bottom about the original register of slaves dated February 24th, 1857 in Vault 22. LSU Special Collection has the original papers that they will allow you to view and even photograph. I gave this information to my cousin who lives in New Orleans, and he took a day off to review the documents and share what he found with our family. Lewis Sterling's family papers is an impressive collection of registers of slaves, daily logs of activities on the plantation, morning reports, which even includes slaves who reported to the fields that day, who received socks or blankets for the winter, bills of sale, and various miscellaneous transactions and notes. All of these papers are either in Colonel Sterling's handwriting, his father's, or relatives from subsequent generations. This is the first page of the birth register that says record of the births of Negroes, all now living, taken from old records this day, 24th of February, 1857 by Lewis Sterling. So if this was recorded in 1857 and it's referred to as information recorded from older records, then you can imagine how far back this goes. What that also tells you is that multiple generations of slave owners were involved in keeping these records updated. This list contains well over 100 slaves, and I have seen certain entries where the individual's birth was recorded in ink in the early 1800s, and then someone came along in pencil in the 1870s or 80s and noted the deaths of these individuals. That tells you how long the white and black families were tied to each other in the same area. This really happened for 100 years. I and several of my cousins who are descendants of these slaves all worked together to match up death certificates and census records with these people and clarify the familial lines to make sure that we understood how we were all related. In this example, I want to draw your attention to entry number 3, which shows Irvin, son of Levin and Big Judy. But who I really would like you to focus on is entry number 4, Linda, also known or shown here as Linder. She's the daughter of the same two people. Well, how do I know that? Because this little symbol right here, where that represents ditto, and I guess that was the 18th century way of writing it, but it also says that she was born in February of 1814. Linda was my 4th great grandmother, which means that Levin and Big Judy were my 5th great grandparents. The next one I want to point out is number 35, which shows Cecily, daughter of Linda, born January 17, 1833. This is Virgil Sterling's mother, who's mentioned in the death certificate. She was also my 3rd great grandmother's half sister. If you notice, the ages match up, because if he was born around 1852 on his death certificate, then his mother would have been about 19 years old when he was born. Additionally, Linda was about the same age when she had Cecily. Lastly, I want to show you the entry that links everything back to Virgil's death certificate. Here is entry 127, showing Virgil, son of Cecily, born February 7, 1856, at night. In some cases, when there's no father listed, chances are the child was fathered by Colonel Sterling, his father, or one of his relatives. The slave owners always made sure they never recorded themselves as fathers of any of these children. It's either the death certificate that tends to reveal it, DNA, or both. And you'll also notice that his date of birth is 4 years off from what the death certificate states. I would consider this birth register as primary information because it was recorded more closely to the time the events actually occurred. That would also correct the record on how old Cecily was at the time of her son's birth. She would have been 23 years old to our knowledge. One last thing I want to cover about LSU's Special Collection Department is another cool benefit they offer, the Special Collections Request System, or SCRC, where you can create an account and schedule appointments to review their special collections in their reading room. When you log in, you can click New Request and set up appointments in advance to visit their facility, and they will have the requested items on hand the moment you arrive. I had the benefit of utilizing this process in October 2022, and I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. Here's the form you would complete detailing all the information that you would extract from the finding aid that we just covered. You would just transfer that information over here, and you would include the title, the volume, page number, vault number, etc. After that, you will go to their online calendar and identify the available days that they are open, which is good because you want to make sure you select days that you do not conflict with holidays that the university observes. In this example, the days with the solid pink lines are the days that the facility is closed. Once you get an appointment set up, it'll show you the confirmation here of the date and time, and after that, you're good to go. You can click on the details to verify you have everything correct. If you will focus on this second appointment here that I had in October 2022, you'll see it shows you the items I requested to review for that visit. When I originally filled out the form, there was a note on their site that said you could request up to 10 items, and I did just that. In these two listed here, you can see the call numbers, such as the first one, T8187, with box numbers 10 and 12, or the second one, H21, volume 8 and 9. All that information came from the finding aid that I found online, and I just transferred it to the form. This is incredibly efficient and a huge time saver for anyone who plans on traveling to a facility like this for research. So I strongly encourage you all To research your parishes of interest extensively and make sure you take advantage of any types of processes and benefits like this that are available to you in your parish of interest. Now, the next two cases I'm about to cover are nearest and dearest to my heart because the last 22 years I've spent honing my skills as a genealogist have brought me to this place, finding evidence of my fifth great-grandmother known as Binky and understanding her story through the Bisland-Shields family papers that I viewed at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson, Mississippi, and estate and court records at the Terrebonne Parish Courthouse in Houma, Louisiana, last October. If you've had a chance to read my bio in the course syllabus, then you're already aware that genealogy started for me when I was 8 years old, when my grandmother, Leona Whitley Williams, taught me to memorize 7 generations of my maternal ancestry. Throughout this presentation, I've covered a few of them already. In case study number 3, I introduced my grandmother's grandmother, Cora Page Fleming, and her mother, Fanny Shields Page. In case study number 4, I introduced Fanny's sister, Aunt Delia Washington, also known as Aunt Doodsy, in which I stated that her death certificate indicated that their mother's name was Nellie Shields. These names were no surprise to me because my grandmother talked about them several times throughout her life. But in addition to them, the one name that was always at the top of the chain was Nellie's mother, Binky. My path as a genealogist started because my first research question was, can I find Binky? Binky is my Kunta Kinte. I've dedicated my life to finding her. In these next 2 cases, I'm going to show you examples of the type of information you can find that can answer such a question. As I stated earlier, researching slave-owning families as if they were your own is paramount. For years, I had suspicions that the Shields family of Adams in Jefferson County, Mississippi were the ones that my grandmother said owned our ancestors. She said that Nellie was raped by Master Shields, as she referred to him, and that the 3 girls, Nancy, Martha, and Fanny Shields, were his children. Well, DNA proved her right. In 2022, I was awarded a fellowship to search the Shields family at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. In studying the family papers on the families of my 5th great-grandparents, William Bayard Shields Sr. and Victoire Benoit, I found this handwritten oral history on the left and a typed transcription of the document on the right. There was a bombshell dropped in here that the director of the archives reacted to by saying, "I think this may be one of the most significant finds we've ever heard about from one of our recipients of the fellowship." William Bayard Shields Sr. was named after his mother's cousin, William Bayard of New York. The document states, in William Bayard's home in New York City, Alexander Hamilton died after being shot by Aaron Burr. The William Bayard farm in New York is now occupied by enormous buildings such as the Empire State, the Chrysler, and the General Motors building. So for anyone familiar with the famous duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, there you go. I couldn't believe I found something like this tied to my family history. Here's a photograph of one of the well-known plantations that the Shields family co-owned with the Bisland family in Terrebonne Parish, known as Hope Farm. William and Victoire's son, Thomas Rodney Shields, entered a business agreement with his brother-in-law, William Bisland. In the family papers, I learned that Thomas Shields and William Bisland were married to 2 sisters, Martha Jane Witherspoon Shields and Mary Louisa Lavanna Witherspoon Bisland, also known as Mary L.L. Bisland, both of whom I will elaborate on shortly. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History also has these 2 photographs of my 5th great-grandfather, Joseph Dunbar Shields, son of William Bayard Shields Sr. and Victoire Benoit, showing him here in a side-by-side comparison with my 3rd great-grandmother Fanny Shields and her older sister Nancy Shields. You can see that they favor their father. The picture of Martha Shields was lost over 50 years ago. In the Bisland Family Shields collection, there were also account books for Hope Farm. One major tip I want to offer here is that when you study the finding aids and descriptive pamphlets for collections like these, Please keep in mind that the descriptions, they don't tell you everything. The description said the account book recorded daily logs of activities at Hope Farm, but it made no mention of the fact that there were lists of all of the slaves on the plantation in the back of the book, including recorded death years, causes, ages at the time of death, birth dates, including the child's name, birth year, even their mother's name, all were recorded in the back of the book. I only found these pages because I chose to look through every single page of the book just to make sure I left no stone unturned. So let this be a lesson that sometimes those who catalog these items and index them sometimes make mistakes, so you can assume nothing. Check every page of the book. I notified the staff of my discoveries, and they were stunned to know the slaves were in there, and they made a note to modify the catalog descriptions. I hope they did so. This manila envelope contains a large collection of U.S. Circuit Court papers regarding a court case in Terrebonne Parish between a man named Robert Ruffin Barrow, the plaintiff, and the defendants William Bisland and Thomas Rodney Shields. Please forgive my shadow showing up on these images when I try to take pictures on the documents. They laminated them, so I had trouble avoiding it. This case lasted 14 years. I found remnants of it here, LSU, the Terrebonne Parish Courthouse, and various places online. It was a high-profile case, and Barrow sued them because Shields defaulted on $227,000 in loans that he owed Barrow, Bisland, and other co-signers. Finding my ancestors in these family records was challenging because this court case created a very messy situation between the Shields family, Robert Ruffin Barrow, the Bisland estate, and the Witherspoon estate. Which brings me to my next case study on Mary Louisa Lavanna Witherspoon, also known as Mary L.L. Bisland, the wife of William Bisland. Thomas Shields and William Bisland had lost the case to Robert Barrow, and the judgment against him was hefty. William Bisland spent a few years trying to restructure his debts, and in the midst of doing that, he died in 1847. Mary L.L. Bisland opened up probate on his estate in part to help settle the debts to Barrow. The Terrebonne Parish Courthouse shows an inventory of his estate, including 6 or 7 plantations and tons of enslaved people, but on one of the plantations, known as Richland, and also near Hope Farm, I might add, Mary listed a separate group of enslaved people she claimed as separate property that were quote-unquote employed at Richmond, and it reads, a list of Negroes belonging to Mrs. Mary L.L. Bisland and employed on the property of the succession of William Bisland, deceased, 64 in number. In other words, she was filing a claim against the estate in probate court to receive payment for the labor her slaves performed on the community property she already owned with her late husband. Talk about milking the system. Among that list of slaves, we find Binky. You know, when I started this journey back in 2011, over the years when people ask me, well, what do you hope to find out? What do you hope to accomplish? Anyone who knows me knows I've always said, look, I just want to see Binky's name on paper. I want to have proof that she existed and that she's not a myth. And I would tell them, if I ever see her name on paper, I'm going to tell the Lord, you can take me now because I'm good. All jokes aside, though, it has actually given me new life and made me feel like a new path has been charted for something better that I never even asked for. And I must preface my testimony by saying I wasn't ready to jump on the table and start dancing when I saw her name here. I still wasn't sure. I'm kind of a person that needs to validate things as much as possible before I make that jump. But this was the first time I'd ever seen that name in all the years and the hundreds of enslaved names I'd reviewed among these families. I had to be sure. Of course, this led me to look into the Witherspoon family. I know that for the Witherspoon sisters, Mary L.L. and Martha Jane Witherspoon Shields, they were the children of William Witherspoon and Jane McClary of Williamsburg, South Carolina. The Bisland-Shields family papers indicated that they migrated to Louisiana when the younger sister, Mary Jane, was a baby, and shortly thereafter, they both died. I found additional information that showed that they died in East Feliciana Parish around 1814. And I knew based on my years of experience researching in the Felicianas that they had probate records dating back to 1811. So I had a very strong feeling that there may have been a succession record on their father, William, that may have listed his inventory and how it was allocated to his children. I contacted the West Feliciana Parish clerk, Tommy LeBlanc, and told him what I was looking for and why. And he gave me his word that he would search for the record and give me a call after the weekend. That following Monday, he told me he had found it and spent the weekend going through it out of his own curiosity and discovered that William had an extensive estate with over 60 slaves. I asked him just to read a few names for me, just a few from the list, because I wanted to compare them to Mary Bisland's slaves on the Richmond plantation. When he got to the fifth or sixth name, he said, it looks like Benkey or Banky or Binky, Binkey. I immediately started crying and I said, that's her. That's her. And then I explained to him how I've been searching for this woman for nearly half my life. And I was just overwhelmed with the fact that it was really starting to hit me that I had not only found her, but also carved a path to explore her family tree. I remember the clerk becoming very emotional on the phone with me and saying what an honor and a pleasure it was for him to be able to help me accomplish this. And he said, I can't wait to get home and tell my wife and daughter what happened here today. This solidified for me a new narrative that oral history didn't tell, which was before my maternal ancestors were enslaved by the Shields, Binky was a slave of the Witherspoon family that married into the Shields family, and through the connections with Bisland, the three families had formed business partnerships and alliances. All of this I would never have known had it not been for finding Binky's name in the separate property of Mary L.L. Bisland. And I would not have found Mary's separate property had it not been for the state of Louisiana honoring the inheritance and property rights of women in the 19th century, as I highlighted in part 1 of my presentation. I've also seen records of Nellie between the age of 10 and 16 years old that was on Hope Farm Plantation. Now, I'm not 100% sure it's her, but I know that my Nellie, she was born around that time, around that same age range, living in the same area, and no other Nellie is listed around that age. It is well known, particularly in Terrebonne Parish, that women were either married or forced to bear children at very young ages, so the close age difference was not surprising to me, especially since this is consistent with the family stories I've heard, which leads me to tell you about the most recent discovery that derived from these documents. After I received the succession in the mail, I spent hours studying it more closely. There was a recorded partition of the estate which detailed how William Witherspoon's slaves were divided among his 3 children, Samuel James Witherspoon, Mary Louisa Lavanna, and Mary Martha Jane, and what the appraisals were for each enslaved person. As I went through the list, I noticed this Binky, age 32, with a child named Dolly, more likely under a year old, and then another child 4 years old named Dinah. The Binky working at Richland in 1853 for Mary L.L. was 26 years old. This Binky is 32 in 1815, so clearly the math ain't mathing. These are 2 different Binkies. Well, since I was able to verify that several of the slaves on this list matched the slaves owned by Mary Bisland decades later, and that several of the children were named after some of the slaves on this list, and knowing that my family loved to repeat maternal names from generation to generation, I thought, is it possible that Binky's mother's name or even grandmother's name was Binky? And that's what I'm looking at right here. So I struggled with this for a few weeks, and then I decided to call my 2 older cousins who I remember, they remember not only conversations with my grandmother, but they also remember with my great-grandmother. And I called my maternal aunt as well. And without telling any of them about my new discovery, I asked them all if they'd ever heard the names Dolly or Dinah. And without hesitation, they all said they'd heard the name Dolly. Not Dinah, though, but they'd heard Dolly. My cousins couldn't remember how Dolly was associated within our family tree, but they were confident that they'd heard the name before. I was completely stunned. They told me that our grandmother, who we called Mama, they said Mama mentioned Dolly several times. And I was like offended. I was like, Mama never said that to me. But The interesting conversation was with my aunt because not only did she remember Dolly, she said that my great grandmother told her that Dolly was Binky's sister. And she said, "You remember that story I told you about a young girl who was about to be raped or taken advantage of by a white man? And when he tried to put his hand on her, she bit him. And as a result, they pulled her teeth out." And I said, "Yeah, I remember you telling me that story." She said, "That was Dolly. I couldn't remember her name until you brought it up, but that was her." Mine told me that story years ago, and I'm telling you, I was just completely stunned. But I was comforted that I had assurances I was on the right track. In the successions and probates that I've covered this far in case studies, they've been recorded estates of slave-owning men who died before emancipation, so the chance of finding names of enslaved people dramatically increases. But if the slave owner didn't die until after the war, what do you do then? What's your next step? Well, this last case study is a lesson in that I learned from in Louisiana Research, thanks to the assistance of Judy Riffle, who I mentioned earlier. Through years of research in oral history, I learned that my father's maternal ancestors were owned by a man named Colonel Richard Hale. About 11 or 12 years ago, I was at the Louisiana State Archives trying to take advantage of the time that I had to research. And while I was in town, I happened to run into Judy while I was there. I figured she was busy, so I really didn't want to ask for her help, but out of the kindness of her heart, she said, "Well, you got me here for a few hours. Is there anything I can do to help?" Now, why'd she go and ask me that? I told her about Colonel Hale, but I wasn't sure what else to do to find proof that he owned, that he owned them, given that he was alive in 1870 and 1880. I mean, he was nearly 100 years old. But then the first thing she asked me was, "Well, have you checked his wife? Do you know when she died?" I'd never even considered it. After I gave Judy her maiden name, she immediately searched a copy of the West Feliciana Parish's probate index book on microfilm. Within minutes, she looked at the index and saw the name Hale, Sarah Rucker, who died May 13, 1859, 2 years before the beginning of the Civil War. She recorded the page number and then searched another microfilm that took her to this very page. You can see here in the heading on the far left side of the screen where it shows succession of Mrs. Sarah Hale, deceased. And the date, this 13th day of May in the year of our Lord, 1859. At the bottom of this same page, it introduces the section entitled Separate Peripheral Property of the said Mrs. Hale, valued as follows. In it, it begins to list the slaves that she owned prior to her marriage to Richard. And this implies that more than likely these slaves came from the Rucker family, which you would then have to cross-reference with Rucker property records to make the connection. In my particular situation, my family was listed among the community property, which means they were purchased sometime after Sarah and Richard were married. What you see here is their property being partitioned into 4 divisions, 2 of which have already been allocated to 2 of their children, and the rest of this inventory provides a list of all of the slaves on each division of land labeled A, B, C, and D. It says here that Sarah and Richard resided on the land which was labeled as A. And the first list of enslaved people you see here attached to Division A included my 4th great-grandmother, Julia Lee, age 35, my third great-grandmother, Mary Lee, age 15, and her siblings, Jim Lee, age 12, Tom Lee, age 8, Corrine, age 6, and William Lee, age 4, all of whom I've been able to verify in census records and death certificates. In the case of Jim and Tom Lee, I've even found some of their living descendants through DNA testing. So unfortunately, we run out of time, and like I said, many topics that I address today are presentations within themselves, but I hope you feel like you learned something today. And hopefully tonight you can spend some time shedding light on those magnolias. They're still out there, waiting for you to find them. Please take note of my information on the screen and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. The course handouts also have my contact information. Also, if you would like to learn more about my journey finding Binky and how I did it, you can purchase my newly released book, When Your Ancestors Choose You, Finding Binky on Amazon.com. You can scan the QR code in the top left corner of the screen, or you can just go to Amazon's webpage and type When Your Ancestors Choose You in the search field at the top of their screen. It has been an absolute honor and pleasure to present this information to you today, and I pray that the rest of your weekend be blessed. Thank you for your time.